what the fuck are y'all doing? The white man crazy.
Yeah.
Hey, what up?
Hello.
Welcome.
Welcome to Left Unread. My name is Aaron.
I'm Will.
We are two dudes engaging in a radical self-education.
That's right. We're two undecided voters about to participate in the upcoming bourgeois parliamentary elections.
Or are we?
Yeah. Maybe we'll abstain. No, fucking just moving on from that.
This week we read Dialectical and Historical Materialism by Joseph Stalin.
Joseph Stalin, the man himself. Yes, Joseph Stalin. He was born in 1878 under a different name and under a different Russia. The only child to survive past infancy in his poor Georgian family, Stalin originally studied at a seminary before proclaiming an oath to Marxism and leaving in 1899. Over the next decade or so, Stalin's militant posture and gorgeous mustache earned him both fame and notoriety, eventually leading to his exile in 1913. Despite what Trotsky might claim, Stalin did play a role in the October Revolution as an editor and member of the Central Committee. His most famous revolution, however, might be his rise to power after the death of Lenin. Whether Stalin was an engineer of a brutal apparatus or merely a product of it, his reign as the Iron General of the USSR is undeniable in its influence on every aspect of the modern age, from map to market, and an ever-present question to all communists alike.
Beautifully said. Yes, and we're reading Dialectical and Historical Materialism, which was first published in 1938 as a chapter of the textbook History of the All-Union Communist Party, Bolsheviks Short Course, also known simply as the Short Course, while Stalin served as the General Secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Dialectical and Historical Materialism was truly the first clear, decisive work defining these key elements of scientific socialism. Like most of Stalin's work, finding a reasonably unbiased account of its creation is quite difficult, but it seems most agree that this was written by Stalin and his secretaries as the definitive resource to create clarity within the party, define the party line, and advance the USSR under its tenets.
Yeah.
It was an interesting work.
Yeah, it's short, it's sweet. It's interesting to me that there are... something that the USSR spent 80 years in existence, right? Or 70-ish. They had like an educational program. They had textbooks. That's something that we don't really consider. It kind of feels like we're scraping around on the internet sometimes when we're like, it's like, go and read this article or go to the Marxist archive and read like the Lenin, or, pamphlet or whatever. But he just had a dead-ass textbook,
Yeah, the Short Course seems really interesting as a resource, and it is kind of like, the Little Red Book or something like that.
Yeah, I was just thinking, I don't want to buy into maybe the Western propaganda or whatever, but like, how useful is it really, right? That's kind of my question right this second is like, I wonder what else is in that Short Course,
Yeah.
I can't help but view it as like an ideological tool, like a weapon, that's so weird though, you know what I mean? Like, that's the fucking CIA speaking to me, dude.
That's exactly right. I think, like, in the context of the conversations that we've had for the last 17 episodes up until this point, having clarity of purpose and clarity of vision and clear definitions for what something is, the direction it's supposed to go, I don't see how that can be a bad thing.
I know. It's just this. It's just this like little thing in the back of my mind that's like. It's the you know what it reminds me of, honestly, is when Bernie was like, Cuba has great literacy. And they were like, but Fidel Castro used it to indoctrinate his followers. Yeah. It's like, you can't win there.
Yeah.
But I don't know, man. That's fucking left a stain on me at this point anyway. Regardless, maybe we should check out what's in the Short Course. But there's other books too, like The ABC of Communism. I've seen that one listed a couple times. So, I don't know.
Yeah, it would be interesting to check out some of the other stuff.
Yeah. It's kind of that same problem, though, of like the broader body of work of like the Bolsheviks even, like we're not out here, we're not clamoring to put Zinoviev on the list, right? we're not reading any Kamenev. So, where do you draw the line, Aaron, is the question.
Yeah, I don't know. And I think my general takeaway from this text is kind of conditional, to be frank. I don't know how to say it other than feel like I'm jumping straight to the end here, but like, this was a very clear work. It did exactly what it seemingly intended to do, which was define dialectical materialism, define historical materialism, and contextualize them in the development of how they came to be and how they are to be used in the perspective of advancing Marxism.
Yeah.
whatever you want to call it, Marxist-Leninism. And I think it did an excellent job at that, but it reads like a textbook chapter because that's what it is.
Yeah, it definitely does. It definitely does, I will say. But it is clear and concise. I mean, we said it was short and sweet. It is just an excerpt.
Yeah.
But, you know, I think especially if you haven't had any reading to do with the Marxist philosophical method or with dialectical materialism or anything like that, then it's not a bad place to start. Just because I think it is very straightforward. I mean, and it's written in that same style, kind of how we were talking about with Marx on Wage, Labor, and Capital, where he keeps building up and like answering the next question. Yeah, he says hints constantly.
Hints, yeah. It's developed like a philosophical argument would be. And what I enjoyed most about it getting into it were all of the philosophical references that ground this in the Hegelian dialectic, which really spoke to me. That's the sort of nerdy shit that I like. I loved all the references to Kant and idealism, and there's a lot of, even though he doesn't name drop Descartes specifically, he is definitely talking about Cartesian realism quite a lot. I like that.
Yeah, it was nice. I mean, I don't do a lot of philosophical thinking, believe it or not. So I don't have I don't have an educational foundation in philosophy or anything like that. I haven't gone out of my way to read any of these people or even to define some of these concepts until this point. I mean, like, you know, before we started reading these books, I don't know if if you said like, what is idealism? I couldn't tell you really, but it makes sense now, you know, not just because we've read this, but also just because we're embracing more philosophy overall.
Yeah. I appreciate years ago when I was studying philosophy on my own, not in a formal way. I don't have a degree in philosophy or anything like that. But when I was studying philosophy and people would count Marx as a philosopher, I was always kind of like, his realm is politics, not philosophy. And I realized the deeper I get into studying Marxism, how faulty that idea is, because Marx is definitely deeply rooted in philosophy. I mean, that is where Dr. Karl Marx got his letters. And so, like, I appreciate now getting a little deeper into our study of Marxism, seeing that it is not just about political struggle, but also has a foot firmly planted in the philosophical realm, even though like the whole point of materialism is to talk about it in the real world.
Yeah.
I appreciate that it exists in both of those spaces, and I think that it rationally does so.
Yeah, honestly, I think that that's really where the extension of our conversation is going to lead to today, is because I'm not trying to prefigure it or anything, but the big question on my mind was like, you know, even Stalin makes it clear here that Marx has a place for the idea in his worldview. But really, I was thinking more of Marcuse when he was talking about, I don't know, something about the way Stalin was really talking about how history is made by the modes of production, the means of production, specifically the instruments of production. It just made me think of that kind of technological apparatus that Marcuse was talking about. And really, the thing that was in the back of my mind having to do with Marcuse was the idea that like the ideal, like the creation of an idea in your mind is still important because it allows us to see like what else is possible, you know, like what alternate possibilities are there? You know, if you were to read this at the time of the USSR or whatever, like say you were a student in the course, it might be really, really easy to agree with what Stalin's saying, how there's like a straight line through history, through all these developmental stages, and it's largely based on the technology. And I think that's easy to agree with.
Yeah.
It's also really funny that he's just like, and now we've done the socialism and we've done it so perfectly that there's no crisis of overproduction. There's no economic crises. It's like, yeah, okay. But I don't know. There's a part of that also that feels a little hemmed in to me. You know, it just was on the back of my mind. Is like there is still a place for the imagination, for the metaphysical, even maybe in this world. You know, I don't know. Do you see what I'm saying there?
Oh, 100%. I agree with that entirely. I think it requires a certain amount of, I guess, imagination, a certain amount of imagination to see. I mean, we're not oracles or anything like that. We're not like looking into the future, but to see a future that does not exist and that requires a movement off of the path we are currently treading.
Yeah.
What a weird way to say
something
that.
Something that he said right in the end. He actually, when he quotes Marx at the very end, for the record, by the way, y'all, we're reading from The Essential Stalin, Major Theoretical Writings, 1905 to 52, edited with an introduction by Bruce Franklin. And if you take a look towards the end, on 324, he's actually quoting Marx at length here.
Yeah.
And he says, or Marx says, mankind always sets itself only such tasks as it can solve. Since looking at the matters more closely, we'll always find that the task itself arises only when the material conditions necessary for its solution already exist, or at least in the process of formation.
Yeah.
There is something so, I guess, I hate to just say materialist about that, but like it is literally built on just what is around. Like the way that Marx puts it there makes it sound like there's almost no room for like the hypothetical even, like the possibility of the future. I don't know. That just kind of weighed on me. An odd way to start this conversation, but it was just there because I think that Stalin's worldview is pretty concrete here. I don't think there's a lot of room for interpretation.
I would agree with that. Quick side note, the quote that you just read from Marx actually is where I got the name for one of my EPs that I put out. It's called The Process of Formation.
The Process of Formation.
Because I see something really, last time we were talking about revolutionary optimism and how the idea that just over 600,000 Bolsheviks took over Russia, and that was like mind-blowing to me and really got me feeling positive. In the same way, I think that this quote about the process of formation, the means and the mechanisms for our liberation already exist.
Right.
They are already either materially here or they are being built.
Yeah.
And like there's something really optimistic about that to me that speaks at least to the dwindling flame of optimism that exists in my soul.
There's something true there. It's like we actually don't have to invent something fantastic for this to happen. Like it literally just requires, I hate that's like sweat and toil, kind of like it's just going to take the hard work of organizing, I'm sick of hearing that, but it's because it's true, and it is like such an obvious answer,
Yeah, but I also think that to a certain degree that's a deflection.
Yeah.
I think that it is true in the broadest possible sense. But I think when people are bringing up their skepticism or questions, it's because they don't understand. We don't understand. I'll count myself among this group of people, what that organization must look like.
Yeah.
The reason we're doing all of this reading, or at least the reason I'm doing all of this reading, is because I'm trying to get answers to what specific sort of organization is required. I know that organization is the answer, but I don't know what it looks like, and I'm trying to find my way toward that finer definition, to zoom in just a little bit. Because I think that it is true, but also when people are like, well, you just have to organize, our organization is too weak, it's like, yeah, so what do we do then?
Yeah, what are we doing with it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, see, the thing with that is that kind of on the flip side, there's almost this fear I have that it's like, we read the 100th book and it's like, ding, the light bulb goes off and it's like, oh, it's just like the Leninist model, like it's just like the party, TM, LLC, all rights reserved, and that scares me a little. The thing is, it doesn't scare me because I'm perfectly willing to accept that as the answer. I want some kind of confirmation of that, though, is the thing. And the problem is that the confirmation of the historical experience isn't really there for me, because it's, look at the parties around us, look at the parties throughout history. I mean, yeah. So, yeah, if the answer is the Leninist model, great and fucking dandy. Like, give me a sign, Lord. What can I say? That's kind of how I don't know. I'm all over the place on this book.
Well, we've already veered off of talking about the essay entirely, but when I said that I think my interpretation of this is like conditional, kind of what I was getting at that I never actually said was that I think like this would be really powerful to read when you're young in your development and reading as a Marxist. Yeah. I don't want to sound arrogant, but if I feel a little past it or beyond it at this point.
I agree with you.
Okay.
A lot of the reason we chose this essay is, one, it comes up so frequently when it comes to Stalin's writing, and we wanted to crack the vault open. Like, we needed a way to get into the theoretical side of Stalin, not just the historical side. Yeah. Because, the truth of it is that he was a deeply theoretical person. I mean, I don't know how apocryphal this is, but he would keep books from the library way overdue, and when he would finally return them or when they would finally get them from his house, they were full of margin notes. He would write in library books, like what kind of sick fucking freak does, like, you don't do that for the shits and giggles, you do it for the love of the game. So like I do believe that he was trying to develop like coherent ideology. I do believe that he was a Marxist, I read a little bit of Vladislav Zubak's first book. He's the guy that wrote Collapse, which I read and loved. His first book is called A Failed Empire, and he's just kind of talking about a bit of the foreign policy, a bit of the domestic policy, each leader in the Cold War. And he says a huge influence on Stalin was just the idea of Tsarist Russia as a whole. Like, he wanted to reclaim the mantle that Russia had. Whether I believe that or not doesn't really matter, because I think that the way that he led Russia was novel from what Lenin was doing, at least, and it also set the tone for the future. I mean, when I said in the intro that he really had an effect on everything, it's undeniable, you know? Even in like the perception of the rest of the world on communism, I mean, it's impossible to overlook Stalin.
Yeah, I think especially coming from the West, I mean, everything you learn about Stalin in the educational system anyway is certainly coming from an imperialist bent that sees him as a despot, egotistical, paranoid despot.
Yeah.
That is the characterization that you are given.
A street criminal that forced his way to the top, you know? And it's like, yeah, he was like, you know, almost like a Robin Hood-esque bandit. He did do like armed robbery for the party and whatnot. But also, like, that's just part of their illegal revolutionary work. You know, I don't think it's necessarily fair. Just because he was involved in like street fighting doesn't mean that he was... I don't know. See, that's the strange thing here. Another big problem is that it's hard to find good sourcing. I mean, even on Wikipedia, all of the sources for the like main points about Stalin come from like a pop history book by fucking Montefiore or whatever. And I know that guy's a moron, you know?
Yeah, I looked at a little bit of that, even writing the introduction for this essay in particular. And it was like so very clearly coming from an anti-Stalin perspective.
Yeah.
And it's just like, how do you get any picture that is reasonably true? Because if you're getting it from the Stalinist state, it's probably colored in a particular direction. You know what I mean?
That's what I was saying earlier. It's like, I don't want to read a textbook from the USSR because it's a textbook, you know, much in the same way we wouldn't go to a US textbook to try to get the real US history.
Yeah. So I don't know. It's tough unpacking any of the Stalin stuff. I think part of what led us toward this essay is it is a purely theoretical essay. And so we could hopefully exercise all of that baggage and actually dig into what the man had to say.
And, you know, as far as I could tell, I mean, you know, there weren't any like anti-Trotsky bites in this, like how Trotsky had a billion anti-Stalin bites in his work.
Yeah.
So, although I'm sure that shows up in Stalin's writing.
Certainly. I'm certain of that as well. But
and when was this written again?
1938.
Yeah, so...
apparently right before or in the midst of some of the party purges and the trials or whatever.
Yeah.
All of the conflicting information that's out there about the dude without doing a deep dive into all of that sort of shit. And I really don't want to do that.
It's okay. That's what I'm here for. Like, I'm happy to do all of that stuff because it is genuinely interesting to me. I don't know. It's like... I feel compelled to do it. I was just fucking around with Chris the other day. We were sitting around and just joking about how I'm running out of space or whatever. I was like, I don't really like we need a new nonfiction shelf because I only read nonfiction.
Same.
I do not feel compelled at all to read fiction. And we were trying to figure out why. And I'm like, there's just no buy-in, you know, like there's not anything here that makes me interested. I have to be hooked onto these stories, whereas I'm hooked before I even get these books, you know, for nonfiction. And jokingly, I was like, yeah, and the truth is in these books somewhere, you know, like if I read enough of these fucking books, I'll just unlock the puzzle, you know, and I obviously don't believe that, but that's how I feel really about like the Soviet study, especially, I think has been really, really, really interesting because it is China. Okay, China, you know, caveat China. It is like the most fleshed out experience of the socialist system. Caveat China. Again, I'll give the Southeast Asian countries a pass here too. But yeah, like they were really trying it and not with a market either. China. Or even Tito, you know, they had a fucking market in Yugoslavia. But like the closest approximation of like people have the means of production via the state at least, that was the Soviet Union, and that's it.
I mean, I don't want to be completely reductive, but like not knowing all of the history as deeply as I certainly should, what I do know is that Russia in 50 years' time went from an agrarian state to fucking astronauts.
Yeah.
Like, how much more confirmation do you need?
Right. They were able to mobilize 150 million people into the second superpower on Earth.
Yeah.
You know?
It's fucking amazing.
Like, period. Yeah, it's crazy, you know? And the funniest thing is, like, people don't understand that. You know, I had this conversation with my buddy a long time ago where he was like, yeah, they did all this industrialization, but they copied it from us. They couldn't have done any of that if it weren't for our technological advantage or whatever. And I'm like, that's the point. Yeah, the basis is already there.
Yeah, based.
Right. Cool, man. Yeah.
I don't know that this is a worthy topic for conversation, but when you were talking about Stalin adding slavery as a part of the development of modes of production or whatever you want to call it, I was thinking a lot while reading it about, this is a moral position too, so maybe it doesn't have any place in this analysis, but like, there's no world where slavery as a system is like morally acceptable. And there was a part of me while I was reading it that was like, almost hand waving away the immorality of these systems, capitalism included, but specifically naming slavery, where it's like, yeah, that's a necessary part of the development in order to get to socialism, in order to get from socialism to communism, like in order to work your way all the way through that development. And I kind of think that that's bullshit. I recognize from a materialist perspective the way that Stalin. Actually, there's a quote in here that maybe we should call to.
Yeah. Yes. It's on, I had like it marked 316 to 319, I think is where he's going into the histories. There's something I will say that, well, I need to hold this thought about slavery. Don't let me forget it. Okay. Secondly, though, aside from that, I really like the way that Stalin goes into these, though, where he's actually talking about after a certain amount of agglomeration, the propensity for trade was available. Like, there are very concrete things that are happening that he's signaling as a transition from one stage to the next. So I can give him some credit there.
Yeah.
But
it felt almost like hand-waving away the immorality of certain systems, recognizing that they are a step on the path toward a system that is more equitable.
Sure.
Even though it's not framed in that context, obviously. Again, I know that there's no room for moral arguments in this conversation.
I kind of get what you're getting at. It's like the means of slavery are used to justify the end of so to speak.
Yeah, and that sits poorly with me, obviously.
So there's something interesting I will say here, and it is the point I was going to make earlier about slavery. It has to do with what I think Stalin is saying here about imperceptible quantitative changes leading to a rapid qualitative change, right? Slavery existed well before it was a means of production. Even in like the prehistory, indigenous peoples took slaves, whether that was through warfare or whatever. They weren't chattel slave. It wasn't it wasn't the same thing, right? There were laws against killing your slaves or whatever. Like, they would eventually become part of the clan, right? They would eventually be released from slavery. And I don't know how accurate this is, but I can see Stalin's framing where that system of slavery kind of built up on the side because of other societal factors, right? Because of other intertribal conflicts or whatever, which, again, war did not exist before agriculture. So, I don't know how accurate that even is. But once that had built up, the opportunity to use those slaves, or like that quantity of slaves being built up then shifted the modes of production from what they had before to a slave system. I don't necessarily think that there was even a choice there. Even as Stalin says that men don't realize how their advancements are going to change the society they live in, I think that could be a similar kind of advancement, right? The nature of slavery changed suddenly because of that quantitative change into something qualitative, and it shifted the whole mechanism of society.
That kind of relates to this quote on 314 that I was going to ask you to help me unpack, actually, because I wasn't entirely certain that I was following it or interpreting it correctly. He's talking about features of production, and this is near the top of 314. He says the second feature of production is that its changes and development always begin with productive forces. And he says, productive forces are therefore the most mobile and revolutionary element of production. He goes on to kind of describe that a little bit, but I sat with that line for a little bit. I read the rest of the paragraph, and I still am not entirely sure I understand or agree.
Yeah.
I think to the point that you were just making, he's suggesting that those changes in production almost have a momentum of their own that will move more rapidly than society is perhaps ready for, and for that reason that makes them palpable for revolutionary change, for mobility or whatever. But I don't know that I'm getting it, really.
To me here, the productive forces that he's talking about really stand in contrast to the productive relations. He's saying rather than the way that men are interacting with each other over the forces of production, this is at least how I read it, what is more important is how those productive forces are actually being used in the society, right? And it's much in the same way I think he's talking about like the actual instruments of production themselves. He's saying, I think at least, that he's saying the actual methods of production, the actual way society produces its societal needs is more important than the configuration of, how man is related to man having to do with that element of production. And that's just how I read it here.
Yeah, he says two other things that struck me there. He says further down in that paragraph, it should be noted that the relations of production cannot for too long a time lag behind and be in a state of contradiction to the growth of the productive forces,
right,
inasmuch as the productive forces can develop in full measure only when the relations of production correspond to the character, the state of the productive forces, and allow full scope for their development. So that kind of goes along with what you were saying there. I get that. And then he adds on at the very bottom of the page that it is the economic crises in capitalist countries where private capitalist ownership of the means of production is in glaring incongruity with the social character of the process of production, meaning that those contradictions inherent to capitalism become so great that they must be overcome because the social relations are no longer in alignment with the productive relations. And there needs to be some sort of balance struck there.
Yeah, and I mean, that crisis is I'm thinking about how Rosa Luxemburg would say that the revolution is the choice to move from one to the next.
Yeah.
It's like that incongruity has become so vast that the action has to be taken, and that action is the revolutionary spark.
Yeah.
Well, I think
it's still something about it. I feel like it's not clicking in my mind.
I think that the point that Stalin is really trying to harp on here is that it's not the way that we configure man and man, right? It's not whatever hierarchy or level of domination or whatever that Stalin is talking about. He's saying that the more important thing is to focus on the methods of production, the actual productive forces themselves, and then in turn the relations will follow suit. He's saying that there can be disparity between the two because one is growing faster than the other, and then when that social relation needs to catch up, that's when there's like a revolutionary spark.
Maybe I've decontextualized it here in this take, because reading it I was just kind of going right along, and that was the first point where I really stopped and was like not sure I understood what he was talking about. So,
well, I just think
maybe I was just on cruise control or something.
Like, just to go back to the original quote, productive forces are the most mobile and revolutionary elements. Okay, the productive forces change and develop society. And then he says, it's not that the relations don't matter at all. They do have influence back on it first. It's just that their development is dependent on the development of the forces. The relations then react. So the productive forces are coming first. The relations are then modeled off of those productive forces.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, and it follows what he's saying here. Like I said, I like the way he goes from one system to the next. He gives like a valid argument, I would say, right?
Yeah, there is a quote where he kind of outlines all of the development of different modes of production.
Yeah. He says there's 5 main types. This is on 316. Primitive, communal, slave, feudal, capitalist, and socialist. It just really bums me out, though, because they were convinced that this was like the next stage of development. To think that the world has regressed overall. I mean, that's even more traumatic because it's like even less imaginary than before. It's like the solution was actually there, and the fact that people hold up the Soviet Union and say like socialism has failed, I think even in the way that actually existing socialism still stands today is easy to say that it's failed because they've given up. I mean, the market is there. I don't fuck with Deng. Sorry. Deng Xiaoping, rotten hell. Just kidding. Just kidding. But I still don't know what to think.
Hey, quick note, listeners. This is Editor Aaron here. I'm about to start talking about handicraft, and I sound like a fucking idiot. So just to be clear, I understand that there is a distinction between commerce and capitalism. The point that I'm trying to bring up will eventually helps me get to, which is that I'm still uncomfortable with the transactional nature of handicraft under a capitalist system. Anyway, that's what I was trying to get at and what I've been wrestling with in my personal life. So just wanted to throw that out there. Okay, back to the show. I've been thinking a lot about handicraft lately.
Okay.
I mean, for good reason. What I'm doing now, what I'm trying to do with my life is be a woodworker, like make handicraft. I technically own the means of production. I have a table saw and a handsaw, shit like that.
Yeah.
But it's not, there's no social aspect to it. The relations in this situation, it's like one person. I'm an artisan, if I can say it pretentiously. And so I see that as like an extension of what I understand to be Marx's position on handicraft. Like the furniture maker runs their furniture shop and they have maybe an apprentice that they take on. They teach the ways of the craft. And then when that furniture maker retires / dies, they pass on their shop to the apprentice and the apprentice continues in that tradition. It's a tradition of handicraft where goods are being produced for the purpose of being sold. And there's like something that is inherently that I've always been kind of under the surface uncomfortable with in that context, because if you would have asked me 5 years ago, I would have qualified myself politically as an anti-capitalist.
Yeah. Now you're a hustle grind entrepreneur, Darren.
Well, that's the thing. That's why I don't like the associations with like, quote, running your own business or being a craftsperson is because like it's so tied up in this like grind mentality existing under capitalism.
Sure.
My question is like, I just have a lot of questions and feelings that I can't reconcile or resolve around that, because I want to see capitalism abolished, but like, where does handicraft play into that? You know what I mean? Like,
well, no, I mean, I think there's an interesting discussion there, because honestly, I think that the core of it is that production is not inherent to capitalism, like producing things, commodities as a way to fulfill our needs is not something that's necessarily inherent to capitalism.
Yeah, it's not a characteristic of capitalism.
Yeah. Now, I think a more interesting question is like, will commodity production, like consumer commodity production, still exist under communism? Like right now you are still in a sense proletarianized, as in, it's not that I'm not putting that as in you don't own the means of production, but in a way you are still forced to sell your labor in order to survive, right? You still have to sell, even if you have the means to produce your own table or whatever, it's like someone is still renting your labor to produce that table for them.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So in a sense, there is still a proletarian aspect in what you're doing. I think what's more interesting is to flip the question on its head and to be like, if in this future stage we expect everyone's needs to be satisfied, how do we plan on doing that outside of, this kind of marketplace commodity production that we deal with right now? And I think handicraft is an interesting point there, because what I've been thinking about recently is the way that these theoreticians will talk about removing some of the division of labor, like even not necessarily super aligned, but when we read Kropotkin, and he was saying that the division of labor has led to this exploitation, I think that rings more and more true the more that we look into it. And the reason I say that is because the characterization of the worker as somebody who can do anything is really something that's like, it's almost a pie in the sky ideal, but at the same time, I completely understand what they're saying. It's like you're not forced to specialize into one particular task, but you could do many things for many people. You're not forced to sell your labor as an artisan, as a table maker or a lathe spinner or whatever. I'm not saying you're a lathe spinner, Aaron.
I bought a lathe like 5 years ago that I've never taken out of the box.
You're definitely not a lathe spinner now. No, but it's like the ability to then create the means for everyone to have their needs satisfied is, I think, more of the revolutionary aspect of handicraft than, the way you might be thinking of it now, where it's like, I still have to enter into a transactional association with another person because ultimately I must sell my commodity in order to make money and survive.
Yeah, there's a couple of things in what you said. First of all, like, one thing that I've always appreciated so greatly about furniture making in particular is the tradition of furniture making, specifically the tradition of the Shakers. I think I've mentioned them on the show before, but like in a Shaker community, you were the fucking table maker. Yeah. Like there are 50 families in this community. That means you need 50 tables for the 50 homes. And so you are the person that makes the 50 tables.
Yeah.
And it's like you're literally responding to the needs of your community and being the person responsible for meeting those needs. You're not producing commodities outside of what is needed for the sake of commerce or anything like that. You're meeting a need. I think that there's something really beautiful in that. It's simple and straightforward. I like that.
Yeah. Not to glorify the Amish, but like I love how 50 of them come together to put a barn up. You know? That's cool.
I think that there's something really dope about that. Something really cool about that. The other thing that's interesting about what you said is in the context of handicraft, there's almost an inherent need for some sort of hierarchical system, because like being something that's so skill-based, it requires the quote master to teach the quote apprentice.
Okay.
So the apprentice can become a master eventually. An apprentice might have all of the means of production, a table saw, a bandsaw, or a hand plane, whatever, however, whatever those things are. But without the skills and a skilled teacher teaching them how to, best use those skills, they're never going to become the master of that trade.
Sure.
So it's like something really interesting there where, to your point, like not everyone can do everything immediately. It's different than an industrial situation where it's like you pull this lever and then you punch this shape. That takes 10 minutes of training, hopefully a little bit more safety training. But like it's not a thing that requires a great deal of skill. It's an inherently mechanized process that you're just being exploited as a worker to do. But like you almost have to have that kind of imbalance in production, at least at the start, where you have a master and an apprentice. It's almost prerequisite,
Yes. So I think that the interesting thing here is that I agree. That's not what's interesting about it. I think what's interesting is that there is an alternate form of domination in that sense. Right? It's not a coercive power of like a weapon or a state apparatus, but it's the idea that the people in charge have the knowledge required to do the thing, right? In this case, to make furniture. And I think it's important for us to think about because to me, it signals the next stage in development. I'm thinking about like a post-scarcity environment, right? If everyone had everything available to them, it's not that everyone would suddenly do everything. There are still hurdles to people being able to make things, right? To fulfill their own needs, whatever. So we have to think about, I think it's really important, I should say, to think about how the methods of control actually shift in that scenario, right? We're talking about exactly what you're thinking about, right? Like master in that sense is someone who has the knowledge and can then pass it down to an apprentice, and there is room, I think there is more room for maybe you might say like social mobility or hierarchical mobility if everyone had access to everything, because there'd be room to practice or whatever. But I'm just thinking about like what is then considered valuable as in powerful in that society is not the access to the material means of production, but then the it's like you're thinking means of production. the brain means of production. No, but that's what I'm saying. It's like the ownership, quote unquote, of the means of production have changed because the means are no longer like the actual material goods. At that point, and this is like super future communism at this point, right? The means of production that then people own are like the actual intelligence to make these things, like the processes to make these things. Like not intellectual property like copyright, but like literally who has the intellect to make these things happen. Yeah, exactly, right? Like the actual methodological things.
Yeah, and there's something interesting about what's funny or ironic about me bringing this up is that I did not study furniture making under anyone. I am a, quote, self-taught furniture maker because to a certain degree, that knowledge that you're talking about, that intellectual property, so to speak, has been democratized because of the internet.
Right.
I grew up watching a TV show called New Yankee Workshop, which has taught me a lot. I knew what a rabbit and a dado was before I ever touched a table saw, like shit like that. You know what I mean? So there's also something there where once the means are available to everyone, there's also an opportunity to democratize the knowledge in a way that makes it available to everyone so that need for a, quote, master would dissipate because all of that is out there and available.
Well, I think even to kind of tie it back into what Stalin is saying here is like, maybe we could view the internet as that kind of material changing device, like just as he talks about moving from stone tools to metal tools, how that changed our society because it doubled the output or whatever. It's like having the internet change the relations of people to knowledge, right? The problem here is that this book did not give us enough basis to have this current discussion.
Yeah, that's true.
But I think that that's the most interesting thing here is not what came in the past, but what comes next. That's a great quote that Stalin says here where he's saying that in order for the People's Party not to err, they can't look at the past. They have to look at the future instead. And it's like, that's fucking real,
Hence, this is on 302. Hence, in order not to err in policy, one must be a revolutionary, not a reformist.
I mean, that's something we've well established. Again, I'm thinking about reform can only extend the last revolution. It does not progress the next, I think that that's definitely in line with what Stalin's saying here.
Yeah. Should we just jump into a cavalcade of quotes?
I think so.
Let's do the cavalcade of quotes.
Yeah.
He has a couple of quotes about what I was calling like great men quotes that I thought were really great. The first one is at the bottom of 305.
Okay.
Hence, of course, hence the practical activity of the party of the proletariat must not be based on the good wishes of outstanding individuals, not on the dictates of reason, universal morals, etc., but on the laws of development of society and on the study of these laws. And I think that goes really well with another quote on 307.
Okay.
After he quotes Marx, which is a banger Marx quote, by the way, he says, "The party of the proletariat must not base its activities on abstract principles of human reason, but on the concrete conditions of the material life of society as the determining force of social development, not on the good wishes of great men, but on the real needs of development of the material life of society." What really spoke to me about that was this thing I've been on for the last few episodes where I've been really talking about, or really kept in my mind, how important it is for us not to place these figures on a pedestal as though they are somehow perfect.
The paragon or whatever.
Yeah, paragons. Thank you. Perfect word. Stalin is not a paragon. Lenin is not a paragon. We need to be careful not to idealize these men beyond the rational. You know what I mean? Place them in the concrete reality of the world. And I think that's also what makes me comfortable with separating the men from the theory in this same sort of way. Because, you know, if we, like we talked about previously with separating the art from the artist, I have trouble with that. And I don't think it's something that I morally can justify in most cases. I no longer watch Woody Allen films as a good example of that, or Polanski.
Sure.
But, you know, say what you want to say about Stalin and what he did or did not do, you know, like separating him from the theory, I think is an important thing in this context for this exact same reason. Because like communism is beyond the quote great men that were at the fore of it.
Yeah. What I was thinking of here was the benevolent dictator. You know, I think that a big problem is it's this kind of, since the beginning of this podcast, I've had this kind of discomfort with a perceived paternalism of the party. You know, like what gives the party the right to lead the people? And what I'm thinking about right now is shifting away from that idea, obviously. It's not that the party has a right to lead or whatever. It's just that the party, at the least, you know, just sees what needs to be changed in order to change the whole of society. It's tricky. I don't know. I'm fucking muddling my own message here. What I think is that, like, I agree. I think that it's beyond the decisions of a few good men, right? I think it's beyond just having a party with the right program. I mean, obviously, I think it is, because I don't think that any of those things have led to the revolution or whatever so far. So there's just this weird disconnect for me. Like, how do you find out? How do you figure? How do you do that? I mean, it's the same thing. It's like I don't know how you don't include great men. And I'm not a proponent of great man theory here, but it's like what gives that spark, right?
Yeah, I think I said something similar when I was trying to talk about Fred Hampton and the need for charismatic leaders like Malcolm X, Fred Hampton, Elaine Brown, Assata Shakur, Angela Davis at one time. These are the figures that come to my mind. But the ideas that they are espousing should be beyond them.
Yes.
And I do think that we need charismatic leaders in order to like spark that in others, right?
Yeah.
To light the flame of revolution in other folks. And I think a charismatic leader can do that, but that doesn't mean that the theory begins and ends with that leader.
Yeah.
And so like there's an interesting kind of balance that has to be at play there. Lenin was obviously a very charismatic leader and did lead the people, but, you know, Leninism can't die with Lenin.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, I mean, the fact that we call it Lenin is a great irony, I guess.
Well, on the flip side, you know, I think there's an interesting parallel in the transition from Mao to Deng. You know, China is not Maoist anymore. They're socialist with Chinese characteristics. I would love to read more about both of those transitions. One, how Stalin came to power.
Yeah.
Again, the problem is from where do I read that? Secondly, how Deng comes to power. Because I think that those are probably, that's probably where the juice is, you know?
Yeah. But I appreciated it coming from Stalin specifically, this idea that like we need to move beyond this idea of great men.
Yeah.
Because again, the version of Stalin that was fed to me as a young man was an egomaniacal despot, and his paranoia drove his politics.
Yeah.
And at least in this text, he's warning us against the idea of putting people on a pedestal in this sort of way.
Sure. I think just what depresses me is that the Soviets were genuinely trying to attempt that. They were like, if we build just like in Parenti, when he says like, he was quoting some minister and he was like, we thought that if we built a good society, then good people would come from it. And that just wasn't the case.
Yeah.
Obviously, I don't think they had enough time. I don't think the circumstance was there, but it is odd to see Stalin say that because he is such a great man of history. Maybe even if he didn't want to be, he was propped up as it. I mean, I've said before how I feel about Khrushchev's secret speech about Stalin, where he denounces Stalin. Mm-hmm. And I think that it was pretty damaging to the political apparatus of the Soviet Union. The alternative is what, though? I don't know how else it would have gone. They could have done some kind of like Mao-style rehabilitation where they said Stalin was 70% good, 30% bad, and the 30% was all the shit that we already know. But yeah, I don't know. I don't fucking know.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
Those stood out to me because I've been on this bent lately thinking about how to separate these figures from some sort of damaging lionization. I don't know. He did have this quote on 313.
Okay.
That is succinct, but I thought powerful. He's describing the kind of social characteristics of production on these pages 312 and 313. And then at the end, he says, or to put it more crudely, whatever is man's manner of life, such is his manner of thought. And I think that that's really powerful, both in a positive and in a negative way. I think we are, to speak from the negative first, of course, I think we have a tendency to be kind of boxed in by our surroundings. We have trouble imagining something different than what the context we already exist in.
Yeah.
And I think this speaks to that. Our manner of life dictates our manner of thought. That's where like capitalist realism comes from, But on the other hand, I think if we can reframe the way we exist, even if we are forced to exist under an oppressive system like capitalism, exist under the regime of the ruling class or whatever, if we are able to reframe and kind of realign our life, then that changes the way that we can think. That's where revolutionary optimism comes from. I think there's something really kind of poetic in that.
Sure. Yeah, I absolutely agree. I mean, on the flip side, it's just in the same way. It's like, we live in such a commodity-driven, transaction-based, zero-sum game that everyone thinks that way, Not to put everything on the ownership of private property, but like I said earlier, it's like, it's really interesting to look at the indigenous critique of Europeans, of European settlers, because the main focus of their critique is the fact that Europeans claim ownership, whereas a lot of these indigenous tribes didn't do that, and their worldview was literally different. They couldn't even conceive of the fact that like they owned land, and it almost feels like, noble savage racism to say that kind of thing, but they wrote it down. The Jesuits had many dialogues with a lot of indigenous people that were like, what the fuck are y'all doing? The white man crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah. The thing is like, how do we change out of that? Part of me wonders like, I know I said earlier that I don't like lumping these into developmental phases or whatever, but like, are we still in the same phase? Are we still under the same mode of production? Yes. I don't know. When does everything get so fucked that we've moved past it? Like how Lenin says that imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism. Mm-hmm. Is it the highest? Is there something worse? Because I feel like we have still, untold horrors to uncover.
Yeah, I don't know.
Fortress America in the climate future or whatever.
I don't know. I think obviously the means of production have shifted technologically in the last, say, 100 years or so. Our production has gotten astronomically high in the last 30 years, even though wages have stagnated. So it's like things are changing around us. We're still enmeshed in imperialist projects all across the globe. So I don't know.
I guess we're really just dealing with the same old shit. It really hadn't changed that much.
Yeah, it's just a different,
more of the same,
different cover on that same old book.
It's fucked, man. I don't. That just really depressed me there. It's like, no. It's just that we've been doing. Socialists at large have been doing this for a long ass time now, and the fact that we feel so helpless is like really indicative of where we are on the curve of things.
Yeah. Wasn't that in Luxembourg when we were reading and she was like, this should be a tired conversation already?
Yeah.
It's like she wrote this 100 years ago.
We're still
and
talking
we're
about
still
reform,
having that same fucking conversation.
It's boned. All right, let me look at my other quotes here. There's a lot of like optimistic stuff in here. technologically speaking. Like, I love in the description of materialism where he says that materialists view a world in which nothing is unknown, just yet to be known.
Mm-hmm.
That's nice. I like that. But at the same time, it leaves that question in my mind. It's like, where is the place for the metaphysical in our society? Like, I don't want to say just religion specifically, but it's hard to overstate the impact that religion has had on our society. Are we just going to flip the atheism switch and call it a day?
I mean, I'd be good with that.
I obviously would too. But it's like how Lenin says that religion or sexuality, a lot of things would become like purely private matters. It's like a lot of the criticism of the Soviet Union is that it was overly controlling in the private lives of its citizens. Whether or not that's true, I mean, it's clear that religion was suppressed on a public level, on a governmental level at least. Whether that, was inflicted upon people's private lives, I can't say, okay? But that's a question that we have to wrangle with. It's like, I don't know, it's almost too operational here, it's almost too rational. It's like, I still believe there is a place for the metaphysical, even in as much as the way that it transforms the actual material conditions through our perception. So I guess where do you draw the line is my question there. What role does the metaphysical still have in our society? Does the metaphysical still fit within maybe a historical materialist perspective? I don't know. I feel like I'm just rambling.
No, I'm trying to wrap my head around a response. It's no secret that I have a lot of thoughts about the way communism interacts with other moral arguments, most notably veganism. And I think like there is a material response to why communists should be vegan, which is really just about the exploitation of animal labor and the inherently exploitative nature of animal agriculture.
Sure.
But I think that while I think both of those things are true, I think there is a larger metaphysical conversation that needs to be had that redefines our relationship with non-human animals.
Sure.
And so like I'm trying to think of a way to respond to what you're saying. Like, I think communism would probably be the best thing that could happen to animal agriculture in that there would no longer be an overproduction of animal products, of animals as commodities. Hopefully, we would reframe the way that works entirely. At the very least, we would see a significant decline in the amount of animal deaths that happen every fucking day.
I'm just thinking about animal communism now because it's interesting, right? Like, I'm just listening to the way you're framing this, right? The exploitation of animal labor. The emancipation of human labor is towards a goal, right? It's towards a goal of like that labor being able to be used for a bunch of different things. I'm just curious what the freed animal labor would look like, because that's interesting, right? Like the productive force of animals in our current framework is to provide us with commodity.
Yeah, it's commodity for us.
Yeah.
The quote unquote labor of animals, if they were liberated, would be as a means of survival.
Okay.
Kropotkin kind of talks about this in Mutual Aid, too, which we should get to.
We should read Mutual Aid.
Yeah.
I agree.
But that also brings up an interesting point, because one of the things that I was going back and forth with the guy on TikTok about when I was making my posts about veganism was he was suggesting that Marx doesn't qualify animals as subjects, and therefore to apply a communist reading of animal labor as being exploited is inherently wrong. I would argue that that's a dogmatic reading, and that's why I think something like this kind of metaphysical allowance is necessary. I think we need to have some sort of space to think in the abstract and recognize beyond what is being fed to us by these quote-unquote great men of
Animals
history.
can have labor if we say they do, like we could just view them in that way, because ultimately their labor is an imprint of our perception.
Yeah, well, I mean, literally there are animals called beasts of burden.
Yes.
We recognize horses, donkeys, cows as being like quote-unquote beasts of burden. That bear the burden of labor so that we don't have to. So, like, I think it's silly to not recognize that. But to your point, like, where is there space for that? If we think of this in such a concrete way and we don't have space for that kind of abstract metaphysical thinking, what are the ramifications of that?
I think the problem, this is very specific, but like I think the problem is the idea of the force as a production. It has to create something, not simply to subsist. Like we're thinking of, because the way I had phrased it, like if this productive force is liberated, what does it go to, implies that something is being created, where the reality doesn't have to be that way. Well,
that's also why it's stuff like this, works like this, are important in creating definitions from which we can work. I think like my response to that question is like, what then is the definition of labor?
Sure.
if I am on a homestead, if it's 1867 and I am homesteading in Alaska or something like that, I am laboring, aren't I? When I'm cutting firewood, when I'm tilling the land.
Sure.
Those are technically creating commodities. The firewood is something that I'm using to heat my home.
Right.
I'm tilling the land that's growing the food that I'm eating, right?
Right. But the production in the sense of an animal isn't creating the same kind of commodity.
But what I'm saying is, like, if not being exploited, an animal's labor then goes toward their own survival. I think that that's the same as my homesteading example. But the production that I'm creating there is going toward my own survival.
Okay.
In the same way that, like, an animal,
the production instead of chopping the wood is like eating the berries or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I can absolutely understand that.
But that requires a definition of labor then, right? What are we qualifying as labor? It was in something we read recently where it was something, basically it was like, you're going to sweat. It was like,
I can't remember.
Yeah, whatever it was. And I was like, that's a funny definition of labor.
Yeah.
But like, that's why having definitions like this are probably useful to the...
Yeah. No, I agree. I mean, it is an interesting discussion overall, I will say.
Yeah. It's interesting being a vegan, reading a lot of this stuff and seeing commentary about animals as commodities.
Right.
Without, to me, making the next obvious step in logic, which is like, oh, that's bad, where it seems like everyone just kind of, the writers of these texts just kind of move on from it.
Yeah, I think that there's something uncomfortable about it because it's you're forced to reckon with like sentience, humanity, all those things, and
which are abstract things.
I know. I was just about to say, which every day we find another fucking level of sentience for animals, pretty much. But it's the idea that this force wouldn't be directable. It wouldn't be directed towards anything. It would just be instinctual, right? Animalistic, anarchic in that sense, Yeah. I think that that's really like where the core of it is, even though an interesting parallel is the idea that our labor wouldn't have to be directed under communism. Like that's the point, is that we're kind of post-scarcity in that case, So it's interesting that we are seeking communism in the liberation of our labor for ourselves, but we wouldn't apply the same thing to an animal, even though the basis is the same. There is something to be said about men making advances so that they don't understand the effect on the society.
That's the quote that I had.
I love the one where are you on 322 right now?
321.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I'll let you take the reins on that one then.
Okay. Well, he says, when improving one instrument of production or another, one element of the productive forces or another, men do not realize, do not understand, or stop to reflect what social results these improvements will lead to, but only think of their everyday interests, of lightening their labor, and of securing some direct, intangible advantage for themselves.
Yeah.
I was thinking of this in the context of AI and the overwhelming technocracy that we are living in, where like we make these advancements that do have an impact on our day-to-day, make things easier, more convenient, or whatever, without considering the overwhelming social ramifications of such a decision. I think the internet is another perfect example of that.
Yeah, I actually had this thought earlier when I was talking about have we reached another stage of development, which I think the answer is no. But I think so much of our like technological prowess is a facade anyway. It's like, sure, we have these technologies, but ultimately the main mode of production is the same old labor as it's always been, especially in the global South. I think it's absurd to think of like a book that came out recently called Techno-Feudalism about how basically people are being used for ad bucks or whatever. And it's like this different kind of productive force. I haven't read it, but I think that ultimately it's that we've just shifted the visible exploitation southwards instead, Yeah. And even I think AI is actually a really great example because like half of those fucking processes were trained by humans at the very least, if not still being actively maintained by droves of human forces from like fucking Pakistan and stuff, when I was on this hunt for more flexible income that I didn't have to actually work for, which is something I'm sure many people do, look for some source of income that isn't an actual job, right? I saw the Amazon Mechanical Turk service where you can do those kind of repetitive tasks and get paid like 3 cents per task or whatever. I've done a bunch of those, and I know that that's how a lot of AI was trained. In fact, when we do every single CAPTCHA, we are helping to train an AI. So I think there's something interesting about this like ever increasing technologies that's still built on the same old base of really old world exploitation. I mean,
Yeah.
really like raw resource exploitation, mining, wood cutting, like those kinds of things. You know, even wrought manufacturing, I think, is still in line with that same idea.
Yeah, I was thinking the entire time about mining cobalt.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's all built on, it just depends on how far away you zoom before you recognize it. It's all built on the back of the exploitation, specifically of the global south or sub-Saharan Africa.
Dude, I mean, that's two books I read in the last year that I know I've talked about before, but How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by Walter Rodney and Open Veins of Latin America by Eduardo Galeano. Both absolutely fantastic books that really spell out every single gain of the first world came at the expense of the third. Okay, and that was by design. So I don't know. Just I'm feeling kind of third worldist at the moment. It's like maybe the revolution isn't due for the fucking first world after all. I mean, it is due, but maybe it will never come.
Well, on that note.
On that note, what questions did this bring for you, Aaron?
None really. None about the content of the essay, other than that one point where I wasn't sure I was unpacking correctly what he meant. Really, the only question that it left me with was, what is some Stalin that I should read?
That was my question, yeah.
This didn't feel like the one.
No.
Even though it is easily the one most commonly added to, the suggested reading lists.
I think just as you said, we could exercise it from Stalin the person. I think that's what many people are doing because it has nothing to do with Stalin. If this didn't have his name on it, I don't think you would even know,
Yeah.
And something interesting you said earlier is, I mean, I don't know if you were specifically saying this was written by him and his secretaries, but it's like, I'm sure he was not the sole writer on this, especially if it was for publication in a textbook.
Yeah, exactly.
And
I guess the grander question that you brought up, I think, is a really interesting one that is going to be sitting with me for a long time, which is like, where is the room for the metaphysical? Yeah. Obviously, I think that has ramifications for a lot of important parts of the way that we live our lives. And so I'm going to be wrestling with that.
Yeah, it's just, since we read the Marcuse, I think that it's really been weighing on me. It's just the fact that, like, you could do everything right and still end up with a system of domination, I think that that's a valid criticism, right? And if it's based on the technological apparatus or the use of, then that's something that we need to be aware of, and the room for alternatives must be possible.
Yeah.
That had a bigger effect on me than I thought when we originally read it. Maybe we should hit some more critical theory eventually. But yeah, that's my question too. What Stalin is worth reading? If you're a Stalinist, hit us up. leftunreadfeedback@gmail.com. Not only that, but did we miss anything here? Is there anything else that you want to add?
Yeah, anything we missed? Anything we misinterpreted? Anything we glazed over?
Any questions that you have? Yeah. Let us know. leftunreadfeedback@gmail.com.
Yeah. Was this worth reading?
Well, yeah, I would say it is. It's just a matter of when, I think that you could read this or Engels, Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific. To be frank, I don't really know if there was even anything you could get from that piece that you didn't get from this piece. Not that I can remember, at least.
They all blur together to me. I have such a terrible memory with these things. I don't hold the text in my mind as well as you do, so.
I don't remember anything specific. I think you could really read either piece, I think there is something nice about reading this from Stalin and understanding that he's not some, like, brute barbarian warlord general, right? That's nice.
Yeah, I appreciated reading something that's not a polemic.
Yes.
So that was nice.
Very few insults in this, if any.
And I think that also makes it quite accessible. So if you listened to this episode but didn't do the reading ahead of time...
It's 30 pages. Go read it, damn it.
If you've done none of the reading up until this point...
What are you doing?
I think this is a good Communism 101, a good essay that gets you started and should help fight off some of the intimidation that comes with the jargon that gets thrown around by more well-read communists.
Yeah, I think a solid place to start, especially if you're interested more on the philosophical basis. There you go.
Yep. So that was Dialectical and Historical Materialism by Joseph Stalin.
Joseph Stalin. The man of steel. The man of steel.
Next up, we are going to read
The Society of the Spectacle by Guy Debord.
Guy Debord.
God damn it. Guy Debord.
Very French. It'll be fun to go back to it. I read this very early in my development as a Marxist, And so I am really looking forward to seeing what it'll be like to come back to it now that hopefully it'll make a little bit more sense to me.
Yeah, I'm excited to expand my own base of philosophy because I have very little, and hopefully this one's not as dense. I know it's not. We talked about the fact that it's bullet points, right?
Bullets. Yeah, it's all bullets.
Join us. Won't you?
Won't you?
Yeah. Don't get left unread.
Bye.
See you.